Pugwash International. I'll give the floor first to you, Reza.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Asle. The global political and security landscape is changing, but not for better. The whole discussion so far portrays the risks and challenges that lies ahead eloquently, the presentations. And if you allow me, I start to summarize the points that were raised as the risks and potential challenges. Rising tensions fueled by uncertainty and apprehension. Low thresholds of national security risk perception, pushing long-term peace dividends and benefits of collective security. New arms race, including amongst nuclear weapon states. The divide between nuclear possessor states and non-nuclear possessor states. The likelihood of use of nuclear weapons, be tactical or low yield, or even running the risk of strategic nuclear weapons to be used. The probability of a small-scale nuclear confrontation, maybe regional, as was mentioned. South Asia was mentioned as an example. The CD, Conference on Disarmament, being unable to address any substantive issues for over 2 decades, although they have agreed on a program of work, and nobody knows what that would bring. The potential risk of nuclear test resumption with far-reaching implications for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. NPT being under strain because not much has been achieved so far, and the risks that lie ahead of the 2020 RevCon, NPT RevCon. The situation seems rather bleak, but now I want to throw some light into this situation and inject some optimism. CTBT is one of the longest sought international agreements, nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament agreements. It's intrinsically interlinked with NPT. CTBT addresses the 3 pillars of NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's non-proliferation aspects, disarmament, and useful pieces of nuclear energy. CTBT was one of the conditions for indefinite extension of the NPT. The agreement that it would be that the negotiating parties would conclude a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, but that happened in 1996, and it has been one of the elements in every NPT review conference that has succeeded to come up with an agreement. Although even if there has been no agreement, many delegations have taken the floor actually during the discussion to highlight the importance of the CTBT for non-proliferation and disarmament. It was one of the first among the 13 practical steps that were agreed in 2000 RevCon, NPT RevCon. Contribution of CTBT to non-proliferation and disarmament can be mentioned as non-proliferation, and it can stop nuclear arms race and can prepare for incremental nuclear disarmament. That can be seen also in the objectives of the treaty as explained in the preambular part of the treaty, which says that it intends to, or the objective is to constrain the development and qualitative improvement of nuclear weapons. It also aims and attempts at ending the development of advanced new types of nuclear weapons. And therefore, it's a meaningful step in realization of systematic process to achieve nuclear disarmament, quote and unquote. So the treaty provides and offers a very robust verification system. It's a good example of what an effective verification system should be. It has 337 international monitoring stations using 4 different types of technologies: seismic, infrasound, radionuclide, and also hydroacoustic. We have the International Data Center, which collects the data from all these 337 stations. They would process it immediately in real time. We would share it with all the state signatories. We analyze the information and data, and also produce some products that are shared with the state signatories. It's very democratic. I mean, it doesn't make any distinction between small states or big states. All can benefit from the data and the data product of the system. The verification regime also includes consultation and clarification process in order to avoid to resort to the last option in the verification system, which is an on-site inspection if there are suspicions that a nuclear test has been conducted. It's comprehensive, universal, and non-discriminatory. That there's a realization that no single country or a group of countries can come up with the system as we have established. 90% of the system is up and running. It's only 10% that we're working to complete the whole system. It ensures compliance and promotes confidence that is necessary for any disarmament agreement. There has been discussions about the impact of the Prohibition Treaty on nuclear test ban treaty. The ban treaty, and people were thinking that the Prohibition Treaty might render the CTBT irrelevant. But the ban treaty refers, or Prohibition Treaty, in its preambular part refers to the CTBT as being one of the core elements of the non-proliferation and disarmament regime. But when it comes to the operative part, the Prohibition article, it goes well. It can be interpreted that the Prohibition Treaty goes beyond the CTBT definition of nuclear test. That might include subcritical nuclear tests as well. It's left vague. But we don't see any, it's my own personal view, and what I'm saying here doesn't necessarily represent what the organization, what is the stated position of the organization. But I strongly believe that it doesn't undermine CTBT, because CTBT has 183 signatory states. It's almost becoming universal. And 166 states have ratified the treaty. So you would compare it with the other. There's, I can say, a universal convergence and agreement on what the CTBT wants to achieve. And there's not that much of disagreement between all those who have signed the treaty, at least, except for 3 which are outliers and then have not signed the treaty. And those are possessor nuclear states, being DPRK, India, and Pakistan. But The others, have ratified the treaty. We have, we have signed the treaty, and 166 have ratified. And fortunately, we hope that we would have one additional ratification very soon, Thailand as a non-Annex II signatory to ratify the treaty and increase the number to 167. CTBT can be bridging, it can bridge the gap over two divides. It can create a conducive international political setting for incremental disarmament. At 2020 NPT Review Conference can be a good, it can contribute also to a successful outcome of the 2020 NPT Review Conference and manage the risks and serve as a building block, showing that some progress can be achieved. At least that's something that we can agree on, and there should be any disagreement on making progress in bringing the treaty into force. Other opportunities that we see is the role that the CTBTO can play when it comes to Korean Peninsula denuclearization. As you have heard, nowadays everybody is talking about this process should be comprehensive, irreversible, and verifiable. And then the CTBT has in its toolbox the tools that can serve that purpose. We have identified the areas of our expertise that can be used for this process, denuclearization process. And they include site characterization, site closure verification, post-site closure and dismantlement verification, and ongoing remote monitoring. These are the things that we can offer. There's another opportunity for contribution of CTBT, and that's the Middle East issue. As it was discussed this morning and at some length, the question of the WMD free zone in the Middle East is one of the critical problems when it comes to the NPT review conferences. So while we cannot reach that objective, we believe that a smaller step can be achieved, and that could be a nuclear test-free zone in the Middle East. It's not that much, one might say that it's very optimistic, an objective to be reached, because then bringing, Egypt, Iran, and Israel to agree on this, while everybody has another, they have different position when it comes to the establishment of this zone, or to have a nuclear test-free zone in the region. But it can be feasible and practical. Why? Because the three states that I mentioned are signatories to the CTBT. By signing the treaty, they express their intention to ratify it. Otherwise, they would not get it. And the three states are very active in the meetings of the preparatory commission, and are actively involved in the discussions that we have over developing the operation manuals of international monitoring system, or international data center, or on-site inspections. So they have a keen interest, an invested interest in following the discussions, participating, and contributing to the whole issue. So in short, for other opportunities, we have the Korean Peninsula and the the Middle East. However, the treaty is yet to enter into force. Everybody knows because there are 8 remaining Annex II states whose ratifications are required for entry into force. So we have achieved a lot, and there's a sense of complacency. I mean, with regard to the establishment of the verification system and collecting so many signatures and ratifications. So the risk that we run now is to lose the sense of urgency for entry into force of the treaty. States are saying that, look, the system is working. And then in some nuclear posture review, you see that references are made to the verification regime, but not to ratification of the treaty. So that could be a sign. I'm saying that that's one example of how people are saying the system is working, so it monitors because it has a proven record when it came to, I mean, it has come so far 6 times with nuclear tests conducted by DPRK. So that's a big risk that we're running. How we have to push for the entry into force of the treaty. The prospects of the ratification of treaty by the 8 remaining states, I should say that it's not, in the short run, it's not very positive. Especially in the, as we discussed, I mean, against the political and security backdrop that you have been discussing since yesterday and before this low-yield panel discussion. Yeah. So then what else can be done? I mean, there have been some ideas. I mean, some people have been suggesting that we might have a provisional entry into force of the treaty. Some others have suggested that maybe we might be able to resubmit an amended treaty text again for ratification, which doesn't include any Annex II. So I believe, personally, I believe that Annex II is a curse and a good omen. It's a good omen because that helped to secure ratification of at least 3 P5 states, because they would know that if the other 2, I mean that everybody would not ratify it, then it doesn't enter into force. So it was easier for Russian Federation to ratify it. It was very easier for UK and France to ratify it. And if you want to do away with Annex II and resubmit it, then one should see first and foremost how long does it take to get that many, I mean 166 ratifications, and then whether all the P5 would be on board. If the US would not ratify, whether Russian Federation would oblige itself or ratify the treaty.
Yeah, they ratify the treaty.
No, I know, but if Annex II is removed,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
And it would be only, for example, UK, France, and Russian Federation with China and US not ratifying, or there would be no any pressure. I mean, it would be binding, legally binding for the remaining, I mean, for those who ratify, P5 who would ratify the treaty and not the others. The provisional, provisional entry into force would not get that much support amongst those who have ratified the treaty, and even with some signatory states, because then they might see that it would not serve their interest. So now that we cannot get in the next couple of years at least, everybody knows what I mean, the next couple of years. So what else can we do? what else the international community can do. So I believe we can do we can have two different approaches. One is to maintain the momentum, and then also work for universality, further universalization of the treaty. Further, let me start with the further universalization of the treaty. Non-Annex II states who have not ratified or not signed and ratified the treaty are 22 states. These are, I always call them low-hanging fruits, because they don't have that much of high security interests that might prevent them to sign and ratify the treaty. 10 of them have not signed it, and 12 more we need to get their ratification. I mean, I mentioned a couple of names here that you would see, for example, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Tonga, Tuvalu, you know, and then if Timor-Leste, Thailand, I said that we're working, Yemen, Zimbabwe, Solomon Island, yeah, these, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, it's easy to secure the ratification of some of these countries and move on universalization of the treaty. Every single ratification would strengthen the norm that has been established against nuclear testing. I always, people are saying that, okay, what is the norm and what is, being a lawyer myself, I always say that, look, it's, there's not that much of difference, but legally speaking, there's a great difference, because norms, legal, international norms are a standard accepted behaviors, but international and legally binding laws are approved behaviors for violation of which there's a penalty. So there's a big difference. But there's an established international norm. Sorry that I'm very talkative. I mean, when I see an opportunity to talk. Yeah. So, but every single ratification would strengthen the norm against nuclear testing, and it creates more political pressure for the entry into force. In addition to that, I mean, working on universality of the or universalization of the treaty, we have to keep the momentum in favor of the treaty's entry into force. So these could include maintaining the relevance. In constructivist terms, a legitimate organization is an organization that benefits its own members. I would give you an example. I was on a interview panel. We were interviewing for recruitment of an HR officer. Angela knows how that might go. So I was the maverick person in that panel, because I wanted to see what the applicants think when it comes to a case anomaly which goes against regulations and rules of the organization, and how they would escalate this to their supervisors also. So I was asking people that, look, if a deputy director general would pick up the phone and calls you and asks you to do something that you know is against the regulations and rules of the organization, what do you do? There was only one honest person, because everybody else would say that I scream at him, I would write at him, I bash at him or her or whatever. There was one very honest applicant. He said that when I received this phone call, I would say, sir or madam, can I see you privately? I would go and sit down with the deputy director general and say to him or her that if I do this for you, what is in it for me? Yeah? So he was honest, because what I was expecting people to say, that it's immediately I would escalate this to my supervisor. I mean, for a P3 or P4, you don't scream at Deputy Director General at the level of an assistant secretary or so. So you have to escalate it to your supervisor. You report that something has happened. You document this, that you can, then it would be reported appropriately. So in a constructivist model, yeah, we have to see what everything, what an institution, how an institution benefits its members. So the CTBT, we have to make this happen. I mean, the state signatories should benefit from the services of the organization, and in terms of security, in terms of international cooperation, in terms of data on products, capacity building, and all these things, tangible benefits. We have to work on increased visibility and outreach. True, we have different initiatives. Shall I shorten?
No, sure.
Yeah, we have an initiative.
Just to leave floor to the people.
Yeah, 2 members of a group of eminent persons that have been established are here in this room, Angela and Bruno. So they do reach out and use their network to promote the treaty. And in addition to that, we have this CTBT youth group, which started with 5. Now we have 400 youth group members which are active globally. I mean, they come, and it's interesting that most of these people are coming from Annex II countries that have not ratified the treaty. Most of them are coming from India and Pakistan. And then we have to promote and increase our cooperation with the other international organizations. So these are the things that we're working on in order to maintain the relevance of the treaty, and to keep the momentum in favor of its entry into force against all the odds that we're facing. In conclusion, entry into force of the CTBT is a practical and tangible achievement. I mean, it's within our reach. It can serve as a building block to encourage further progress in nuclear disarmament. And we talk about new international instruments. It's good, like this morning, prohibition or abolishment treaties, but one should see that, look, we have already a treaty that has been hardly negotiated. Over 2 decades of time and efforts have gone to secure so many ratifications and signatures to this treaty. So we need to at least make it happen. I'm not saying that no other attempts should be made. I'm saying that at least some support should be and push should be given to the entry into force of it. And then, as a Persian proverb would go, a 10 cent in hand is better than a 100 non-guaranteed promissory note. So let's get the 10 cents and then wish for the 1,000 promissory note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we move on to response from Pugwash International Secretary General.
Well, I am speaking, of course, on my own, not on behalf of Pugwash, so as everybody. As everybody here is speaking on his own capability. And thank you so much for the invitation. I want to start with something which has to do with the CTBT. We all know about the Annex II. I don't get into details. Then, so eloquently, Reza has been mentioned up to now. There is a problem. I think the problem is that among the the 8 now missing countries, yes, of course, there is the United States and China. China, as far as I understand, is essentially waiting for the United States to take a step. The United States is not taking the step. If the United States is not taking the step, this can be a sort of break for other countries to participate. And the participation and then the ratification by the US will be a tremendous important if it happens. It is very seriously important in a negative way if it does not happen. And it does not happen for many reasons, including the particular ratification system in the United States, the relation between Democrats and Republicans, blah, blah, blah. But, and that's the main topic which I want to address, seen from outside, people that don't know, countries that don't enter into the details of the ratification system of the United States, it's a message given by the USA, we don't want to sign this treaty since we want to take the full freedom of action, whatever it is. It's a sort of nuclear hubris. We are powerful, we do what we want, and that's it. And I think that this is a message which is very negatively taken by other countries. And I go back to the title of this topic, of this meeting, Nuclear Disarmament Feasible, Desirable, Attainable. Attainable is a sort of a copy of feasible, but the same title was used many years ago by Joseph Rotblat to prepare a paper where a conference, nuclear disarmament is feasible, is desirable. I think the fact that we are keeping the same question now is a sign that there is something wrong in the old system. You see, we cannot go on and say to countries that do not possess nuclear weapons, the countries that have nuclear weapons are not going to proceed in the direction of disarmament. We keep our own nuclear weapons, and you should not get them. This can work for some time, but cannot work forever. Most likely will not work forever. The future is uncertain, as Niels Bohr was saying. Predictions are especially difficult concerning the future, which I think it's reasonable. We don't know what is going on in the future. But certainly, if this attitude of the nuclear power states is to say we decide our own and we are not taking any commitment in the direction of disarmament, there will be going to be people, countries that are essentially upset with this, and they will do something different. And the CTBT is one example. The US has a special role, a special responsibility, and of course also Israel, India, Pakistan, China, and then on his own Egypt, Iran, and the PRK. There is a positive development recently concerning the PRK. The symbolic destruction of the nuclear test site is something which is should be taken as a positive message, but we have to see how the DPRK relation will evolve and how things will go there in that part of the world. They are talking about a nuclear-free zone in Northeast Asia, so well, let's see. Let's hope. That's a very important step, but we have to see how it will evolve. But in the meantime, you see, there are not too many I would say, agreement institutions that deal with nuclear weapons and which are, so to say, open to signatory by all countries. One is the CTBT, that has been mentioned in the details, so it's very important, of course. The other one is the most important, the NPT. And then we have the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And let's get into the NPT. The NPT is the model of non-perfect, so to say, agreement. It's a lot of problems, distinction between nuclear state and non-nuclear state, lots of commitment differently. It's not an even treaty. It worked. It worked up to now. Up to now. The number of nuclear weapons has been limited. If you go back, we had discussion before about what the attitude was on after the World War II. So if you go back to 1950, people believed that all states will have acquired, or state of a certain size will have acquired nuclear weapons. And nobody believed that you could reach 45,000 nuclear weapons with Russia and 32,000 nuclear weapons in the US. Nobody believed that this was going to be the limit. But the expectation was that every country was going to have nuclear weapons. And in Europe, in many other regions, there was been a big effort to contain the nuclear desire. Even Italy was thinking about getting nuclear weapons. In fact, is explained by the difference between the signatory of the treaty NPT and its ratification. And it's about 5 years. So what I want to say now, well, I want to say that in fact, we cannot expect this discrimination to go on forever. And there are specific problems with the NPT. The NPT as I would say, first of all, as a so to say, crisis of credibility in its own. The crisis of credibility has to do with the review conference. You see, of 9 review conferences, 5 did not end with a final document. Then if you look at the final document of the last 2 final documents, 2000 and 2010, the decision has been not implemented. So there was no really 13 steps taken all seriously, and as been repeated here many times, there has been no conference on the WMD free zone in the Middle East. So the issue is that people are asking, what are we doing every 5 years? What are the sense of having large international meeting that gets some result that goes nowhere? What is the effort of doing this? What is the reason of that? But look, the biggest threat, and I'm kind of surprised that we have not been discussed this enough recently, is the issue of the Joint Comprehensive Plans of Action. You see, this is a disaster. I think that for internal political motivation of the actual President of the United States, an agreement which was very positive, which was in fact containing the danger of proliferation in the important region of the Middle East, has been killed, or is going to be killed. What countries expect Iran will do? I'm sure Reza knows, but he's not going to say it.
No, I don't know anything. It's in my pocket. The blueprint.
The point is that I don't see a positive act. If I were in Iran, I would say, okay, you want to kill the treaty, we don't have any advantage from it, we don't follow the treaty anymore, the agreement anymore. It's not a treaty, it's an agreement. It's a plan of action, just to avoid the complexity of ratification of a treaty. So if this goes on, then what will be the reaction in the Middle East? What is the reaction of Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has not signed the additional protocol, is not even the member of the CTBT.
No, we have not signed.
Has not signed the CTBT, and still the actual leadership in the United States is supporting nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia. How does the situation in the Middle East is going on? The WD free zone in the Middle East has been killed since Israel was not enough confident that the result would have been interesting. So we have a shrinking of the, so to say, the credibility of the non-proliferation treaty. It's not that it's been totally killed, but you see, you cannot go on forever in a certain state of uncertainties. The same for the Comprehensive Test Ban organization. I'm very happy that Reza is optimistic and has some kind of and is mentioning the program of the CTBT, which has done wonder. But this limbo in which the treaty is not going to enter into force cannot go on forever. And if there is a modification of the treaty that will kill this 44-member, absurd requirement, then you will have probably other states that will say, no, I'm not going to sign it anymore. I'm not going to sign it anymore. I was not understanding what you were mentioning about Russia, but maybe Russia will say, okay, then what can we do? I think that there is, the nuclear ban treaty. The nuclear ban treaty is the last treaty which has, so to say, an open membership. It's not a bilateral, trilateral, short lateral treaty. You see, the treaty is maybe not perfect. In fact, it's not perfect at all. But it clearly carries on a political message. The political message is certain countries are not happy anymore with this discriminatory regime about nuclear haves and nuclear have not. And if some countries are unhappy with this, the consequence can be very severe. We always think about South Asia, we think about Northeast Asia, we think about the Middle East, but there are other countries that are not happy with the situation. Do you ask yourself why Brazil and Argentina did not agree with the additional protocol? It's not that they have they are complaining. They are unhappy. They purposely don't go anymore in the direction of nuclear disarmament since they feel that they've been misled. And if at some point in South America you have some kind of security problem, then you can expect that nuclear issue will come back again. So if the big nuclear weapon states don't make the right attempt to soften the separation between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, we have the high risk of running into the future of a very much complex and possibly intractable situation. And this goes against all the argument that maybe it's better to have nuclear weapons so that they can prevent conventional weapons. If the attitude is that nuclear weapons are useful, many other countries will take the same conclusion. And it's not too difficult. In terms of nuclear, and then I finish with this, in terms of, we have all to remind that building some elementary nuclear weapons is something which is easy. I'm teaching this to my students. You want to build the nuclear weapons, take this, and so on. Easy.
So you're a proliferator then?
Yeah, I mean, I can teach my students how to build a car, what are the physical principles of a car. That doesn't mean that I'm able myself to build a car. It's too complicated. So I'm not able myself to build a nuclear weapon. But you see, the principle is not so sophisticated. We are talking about 75 years old technology. It's a little bit like inventing the wheel. There are more sophisticated technology. There are cybersecurity problem, blah, blah, blah. Lots of things. We've been discussed at length. The point is that and also there is an absolutely connection has been explained by Makiban and others today between civilian nuclear energy and military nuclear energy. They are not two different baskets. I mean, they are interconnected baskets. And I remind you, if you want to enrich uranium to 3.6%, you have done half of the work needed to enrich to 50%, to 90%. Exactly half. 3.6 is exactly half of 90%. Why? Since at the beginning in the centrifuge, the work is done by taking out the uranium-238. At the beginning, there is much more uranium-238 than at the end. So, if you allow to a country like Iran to enrich at 2.6%, the difference between allowing them to go on to 90% and not is the verification. Is the fact that there are people there, the agency in Vienna, that controls what we are doing. And this applies to everybody. And in order to have the agency in Vienna to control what you're doing, you need to be in a positive environment with the agency itself, and you have to live in an environment where you can have, in fact, a cooperation between states that have to do so one or the other one with nuclear energy or nuclear power. In conclusion, and I'm sorry for, I think that the risks are serious. The fact that we are now in a position in which we can most likely agree that there is going to be not a nuclear weapons, a new nuclear weapon state in the next maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years, it's good, it's positive, but we should not pull the rope too much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have a little more than half an hour for questions and answers. William Potter, please.
Thank you very much. Chair, thank both of our speakers. I have some questions for both of you. Reza, it would be interesting for me to hear from your privileged position whether you believe that there would have been any prospect for Iran agreeing to the signing of the CTBT as part of the JCPOA process. I know the United States chose ultimately not to push on that matter. They presumably had various consultations, but I would be interested in your perspective on that point. I have several questions that relate to Mr. Bolton's return to the U.S. government and his kind of very well-known opposition to the CTBT, where he kind of followed Soviet history and airbrushed out any references that the NSC ever made to the CTBT in his prior incarnation in the U.S. government. And so one could at least, it seems to me, imagine the U.S. seeking to withdraw, not seeking, actually withdrawing the CTBT from the Senate. I'm asking this as a question both for our panelists, but possibly also from people in Washington. And were that to transpire, I'm kind of curious, Alexei, what the Russian response might be. I mean, they've enjoyed recently hammering the U.S. For its lack of support for the CTBT. It's one thing when they've signed, the treaty remains in the Senate with no prospect of ratification in the short term, but it would be another signal altogether were the administration to withdraw. I think indicative of the attitude of this administration, Bruno, is the occasion at this last PrepCom when the French introduced supposed to be a joint statement dealing with the DPRK, which called for all of the things that one would expect the parties to call for return to compliance with the NPT, IAEA safeguards, this, that, and the other thing, conspicuous by its absence.
Look at me, I have nothing to do with
I'm just, I have to kind of try to engage you. Okay. The French were very clear about why they did not privately include any reference to the CTBT. You can imagine it was the input of the U.S. So the last point I will make here, and this is probably more cute than it is serious, there was discussion in Moscow last week at a U.S.-Russian nuclear dialogue dealing with the DPRK. And one distinguished former Russian ambassador suggested that perhaps it would be clever on the part of the DPRK to sign the CTBT and to announce that it would be prepared to jointly ratify along with the United States. So I think that was not a terribly serious proposition, but it would be clever move perhaps by the DPRK. So I put those points on the table. In particular, Rachel, I was curious from your vantage point whether you thought there was ever any prospect of the CTBT somehow being linked to the JCPOA.
Please.
Shall I? Oh, okay. The Iran has signed the treaty, but not ratified it yet. So, ratification of the CTBT to be one of the provisions of JCPOA, I would tell you that it would be a no-go for the Iranians. I mean, as far as I would know. Why? Because they didn't want to put everything, and I mean, in a tray and give it. But after JCPOA was finished, and we have, I mean, Lassina has approached a couple of times. He had discussions. Last time even he met with Javad Zarif in New York during the high-level week of the General Assembly. So the Iranians have constantly mentioned this, that they don't have any objection with ratification, or they don't have any problem ratifying the CTBT. And that comes from the general, and I'm saying this myself also, whenever I have a presentation on CTBT, that all those countries who are parties to the NPT, I mean non-nuclear weapon states, who are parties to the NPT should have no problem ratifying CTBT. Why? Because being a party to the NPT, you forego your nuclear weapon option. You cannot build a nuclear explosive device, let alone testing it. So it's by that. And then, I cannot say it in public, but I can say it here. But even if you're supposed to violate NPT, so you violate CTBT as well. I mean, it's the point is that there is no any additional commitment on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT, to ratify the CTBT. And Iran knows that very well. The only thing that Javad Zarif was sharing with Lassina was that, look, we don't have any problem. We want to see how far the JCPOA implementation goes. If that goes well, then we have a voice to convince the Iranian parliament to ratify this. You should note that there were so many, I mean, when JCPOA negotiation was concluded, there were so much uproar in the Iranian parliament, because at that time, the conservatives had the majority in the Iranian parliament. So if you now go to the Iranian parliament and ask them to ratify CTBT, they would say, okay, what is in it for us? That goes back to that HR officer who says that, okay, I accept this, but what are the benefits of, and Iran has, I should not be the one who would talk about Iran, but Iran for long, Patricia knows that from the discussion at the CD and many other, seminars, workshops, or so that the Iranians have been invited since from uni there when she was in Geneva. The Iranians have always saying that, look, we have ratified all the conventions and treaties on weapons of mass destruction. Iran is a party to CWC, Chemical Weapons Convention. Iran is a party to NPT. Iran was one of the signatories, first signatories. The first day that CTBT was opened for signature, Iran was amongst the first ones signing the CTBT. And Iran is a party to Biological Weapons Convention. So they are saying that we have been party to all this. But yet, I mean, what is the situation that they are facing? Iran has accepted the safeguards, IAEA safeguards. So I don't know whether they have, I mean, don't ask me, because I might have my own personal view whether there was any shortcomings, let's say, put it this way, in the Iranians' interpretation of their safeguard agreements with the agency to report the early days on their enrichment activities or preparing for the enrichment activities, because they were seeing any obligation for themselves because they didn't accept the supplementary codes of the safeguards. So they would say that only 180 days before introducing nuclear material to the facilities, we have an obligation to report to the agency. And then they followed that interpretation. It was only after President Khatami, and there was an agreement with Iran and EU3 on suspension of the enrichment activities prior to JCPOA. It was in 2000.
We have to move
That's
on because
okay. Sorry.
I will skip since you said a lot. And
Yeah.
let's have some other questions.
Okay. Then
Okay,
very,
let's
very
have some
brief.
other questions.
Okay, sure.
Philip, please.
Thank you. Appreciated both of your presentations. With respect to the CTBTO, Reza, you and I have not had a chance to meet, so I hope you'll forgive me for saying that I think you're being too modest. You said that the international monitoring system was 90% complete, but I wanted you to say also that the U.S. National Academy of Sciences had studied the system and found that it was already effective, even though there's still 10% to go. And I also wanted you to say that the CTBTO has resources and expertise for verification that nobody else has. And the reason I say this is because in our interactions with members of Congress, in our interactions with the press, with the media, and by our I mean the Council for a Livable World and the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, in our interactions with Congress and the press, they've never heard of the CTBTO. They've heard of the IAEA, but they don't know that there's an organization that has, if I can put it this way, IAEA-like capabilities when it comes to test ban verification. So I think we've got a lot of work to do because those same members of Congress and members of the press are very quick to jump to the conclusion that, of course, whoever it is you're talking about, North Korea or somebody, will cheat. And of course, we would never know whether they cheated or not because we have no way of finding out. And so again, I just want to appeal, but I think we have a lot of work to do to make capabilities of your organization and all of that better known.
I want to answer a quick question on behalf of CTBT. That's the point, is that the difference between CTBTO and the agency in Vienna is that the agency in Vienna needs on-site inspections, which is a different thing. It's much more, it's much more demanding. The CTBTO just putting around seismics that has a lot of information without needing of being invasive into the country. So in this sense, I think it should be underlined that the CTBTO works, finally. And in fact, has less problem in working than the agency, Atomic Energy, in Vienna.
And let me add this, I totally agree with you. We need a lot to do in Washington, but we need people who help us to do that. Yeah, I agree with you that people in Washington, and especially with Senate and the staffers, they might not know that much about CTBT when it comes even to nuclear testing, and the journalists. The first thing that is, even when they quote or they mention the data that we are providing, they say that the UN nuclear watchdog IAEA. I mean, they make a mistake between CTBT and I mean, that's something that we need to do more in the US. So I totally agree with you. And then whether that should be part of the ratification, signature and ratification, I believe should be part of any comprehensive agreement with DPRK. That has been mentioned. It was on Monday that there was a joint appeal by the foreign minister of Belgium, Iraq as Article 14 coordinators, and Lassina, a tripartite joint appeal saying that any agreement with DPRK should include signature and ratification of the treaty. And with U.S. posture review, I mean, Bolton being there as National Security Advisor also, we believe that the stated position of the U.S. is the nuclear posture review. In the nuclear posture review, the US, although they are saying that they don't push for ratification of the treaty, but yet they say they call on everybody to maintain and respect the moratorium against nuclear testing. And plus they actually support the verification regime of the CTBT. So we note that stated policy of the US. Sorry, very quickly.
Thank you.
I didn't.
Matthew Bob.
So, and honestly, I think that stated policy is the best one you can hope for from the Trump administration, better than I really expected. Let me ask you about possible steps forward. So, as you noted, the ban treaty includes a ban on nuclear testing. Let's imagine that in a few years' time, there are enough ratifications that the ban treaty enters into force. What would happen if a group of ban treaty participating states came to the CTBTO and said, since we don't have this verification organization yet, will you fill the role of verification organization for this particular obligation within the ban treaty? Then in a certain sense, you would not be just a preparatory organization anymore. You'd be actually verifying a treaty that was in force. What if a group of states that had ratified the CTBT said, jointly announced, we are going to behave as though the treaty has much support for that? But I wonder if you could explore that a little bit more. Could we maybe build support for that over time? Because I fear that actual legal entry into force of this treaty is going to be a long time coming.
Let's have an order.
Yes, Professor Cotta wants me to take one more, and I think that might be a good idea. Olof.
Yes, several years ago I had the pleasure to serve as a board member of NorSAR,
Yeah.
which is the Norwegian seismic array station. It's part of the regime. It was, NorSAR, by the way, was established 50 years ago, so it has 50th anniversary this spring. Financed by the US Air Force, who wanted an array station close to Novaya Zemlya, which was a very important Soviet nuclear test site. And I remember from those years, there was this concern that the regime might, from a technical capacity point of view, may not be able yet to fully register subcritical testing. Is that an issue anymore, or are you confident that if someone wanted to
I want to answer.
proceed along that road, you would be able to detect.
Okay, let me say about subcritical test. We're talking about hydronuclear, okay. I don't see why you should, I mean, I don't see honestly, if you have an hydronuclear test or hydrodynamic test, how can you detect it? I mean, there is no seismic signal, so it's, forget about. I mean, the point is that what is, there are one point about this hydronuclear. Are they allowed or not? I think since the main actor in this field is the United States, they would say to you, to me, to whatever. I say, no, forget about it. Hydronuclear test, we can do it on our own, and it's not a nuclear test. And I think in that sense they are right. I would not stress the thing of subcritical test as something which, if it's subcritical, is not a nuclear test. And I think it would be better not to steer the trouble. I just want to add one thing about this CTBT. I think that since, as Matthew was mentioning before, there is really no chance that the US will be, in the short term, will be ratified. I think the thing which I would like to do, and we can talk even inside the CTBT, I think there are few things. First, convince China, men near you, and and the Chinese. In fact, I already talked this with the Chinese representative of the CTBTO some time ago. It was agreed. China should avoid having an attitude of following the U.S. lead on this. You should make have the attitude of say, we go ahead with ratification. Second point, if the US is not ratifying, I think the best thing that we can do is to just keep the thing undercover somehow. And make, for what, no, not undercover, I mean, it will be obvious, I mean, undercover does not be, I mean, the point is that you don't want to overstress this. The point is that the CTBTO is working, so we can show that in fact there is no nuclear weapon test apart from North Korea and so on. So the question is that let's operate like if it were in force. And I think the United States is not going to make a nuclear test. Many other countries will not make a nuclear test. And I think the point is that the system works, the organization works, and that will be, for the time being, enough. Certainly, we are covering under the carpet the problem of non-entry into force. And again, if we can go on for some time, that's good. But notice that in fact, even India and Pakistan, they did not feel the need to have a further test. And Israel did not feel the need of any further test apart from the Vela episode of 1979, which is questionable anyway. So I think that there is no big need of nuclear tests. The only was DPRK. If DPRK is put into the side, then this will be already the positive side. The issue of JPCOA, which I think it's in a sense is more dangerous thing. I think to answer, I mean to comment on what Bill was mentioning before, the Iran, in my opinion, will not accept anything if the JPCOA is not kept alive. If the JPCOA is destroyed, you can expect from Iran nothing. The point is that what Europeans and other people can do in order to preserve the JPCOA. And this is a difficult question since we are trying to understand how this can be done. And it's very difficult since both Russia, China, and the Europeans are certainly supporting the maintenance of the JPCOA. But the problem of secondary sanction, the problem of, it's too much complicated. We need to understand exactly what we can do. And if there is anybody which is interested in this specific issue, please get in touch and we'll try to see what we can do.
Thank you. Reza, short answer because we have two more questions on,
okay.
on the roster.
As act, if if the banned treaty parties would come to CTBTO asking the CTBTO to act as verification agency or organization for the banned treaty, legally speaking, it's impossible, except that state signatories, because that's decided by the state signatories, would agree that we would do it provisionally until the treaty enters into force, and then the state parties would decide whether we can continue with that or not. That's the legal, the legal aspects of it. And also, politically, that's going to be very charged proposal. Then there was the proposal that some states would, ratifying or signatory states would say that it's legally binding for us. That's a good proposal. That's a good proposal, and any initiation on that would be welcomed. Maybe you would start talking about that as well.
Good idea for an American to take the lead.
Yeah. But China not following the US rule. So what can be, what I would mention is that China, like the Russian Federation and the other P5, if you ratify it, because it cannot enter into force until and unless all the Annex II states, including the US, would ratify it. So there is there should be no any problem. The only thing is that one might say that if China decides to conduct nuclear tests, then it's, in accordance with the law of the treaties, Vienna law of the treaties, you should not undertake any action that might impair the spirit or letter of a treaty or an agreement that you have signed. But look, if the US would conduct nuclear tests, they have done it first. You can say that since the others have violated, then not violated actually, they have not honored their signature, so China would not honor its signature. I'm hypothetically speaking.
No, but let me say, you have some parentheses about the law of the treaty. The law of the treaty says that if you sign and not ratify, then you want to get out, you have to justify. But the United States is not part of the law of the treaty.
Yeah. But I'm saying, in generally,
they do not accept the law of the treaty.
Yeah, but that's an international customary law, even if you have not. It's.
And the United States accepts that it is customary international.
Yeah. So, and then subcritical test, it's a very controversial issue. It's used to be until the banned treaty concluded. So then the countries who were raising this at the meetings of this, at CTBTO meetings, in particular GRULA countries, Brazil being the leading country, they have stopped mentioning that. Although Brazil was supported by Switzerland and Austria on this issue and some others. So
We'll do the two last questions, Pat Roberts first, and then finally Henry Caesar.
Well, I wanted to join the discussion about ratification in the United States. I liked Paolo's summary at the start, which was blah, 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 I think was your summary of the domestic politics of the CTBT. I think it's correct to observe that nuclear policy was made before Mr. Bolton arrived, and it's correct to worry about that fact. This nuclear posture review was, of course, the posture review of Mr. Mattis rather than Mr. Trump. And we don't really know what will happen the first time a serious nuclear policy question that's already been decided goes over to the White House. That said, let's recall that Mr. Trump turns on everybody sooner or later. Essentially, the entire staff around the president is gone. So there's a question of how long Mr. Bolton will last. And I wouldn't necessarily assume that the drift of policy, even while Bolton's in the White House, is against the CTBT. The proposal that you make, or that you passed along somewhat half-jokingly, is just the kind of thing that would appeal to Mr. Trump, of cutting a deal with Kim to do this jointly. So I think it's extremely difficult to predict what this president would ultimately choose to do about the CTBT, and it would depend fundamentally on the moment in which it's presented. A word of advice from someone who's spent time on Capitol Hill advocating for the CTBT. The argument that the regime is in crisis, don't waste your time making that argument. There has never been a period when American policymakers haven't heard that the regime is in crisis. Go back to 1985, that review conference, and essentially ever since. So it may be true, but it has no impact on people who care about the issue. Secondly, I think the argument that it prevents proliferation, I wouldn't make that much of that argument either. It doesn't prevent entry-level development of entry-level capability. It does, as you argue, prevent an arms race. But again, be mindful of your audience when you're advocating in Washington. The perception of most people in Capitol Hill interested in nuclear things is the arms race ended when the Cold War ended. And if there's another arms race coming, it's possibly in the US-Russian relationship, for which the CTBT is irrelevant to the development of advanced capability. So I wouldn't make an arms race argument either. I think the core argument to make to the Congress and to congressional staff is that to pose the question, what's changed in the 25 years since you rejected this? And one important change is that 25 years ago we didn't know if science-based stockpile stewardship was going to work. It does. That's an important change. Lastly, I think by and large, the people on Capitol Hill who care about this issue and know something about it generally believe that opponents of the treaty have vastly overmade their case, and they also believe that proponents of the treaty have vastly overmade their case. So the more moderate in tone you can be, I think the more credibility you will have with the interested congressional staff.
That's what we wanted to say.
Thank you. Henrik?
I see there's one more there, by the way, also, so maybe.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'll be very brief. The first thing I'll say is unfortunately I have to leave tonight for other duties, so on behalf of the Nobel Committee, fortunately Asta will be staying on, but still, we are very proud that you take out this time. I know the sorts of busy schedules you have, and that you come to these Nobel Symposium, and I can promise you that we take very seriously the sort of input that we get, so that's just fantastic. My question is very short, and we may not even have time to answer it, but I know a lot more about the CBTB than I did just an hour ago. Of course, I've read a lot about it, but this is very interesting and technical. But if you go to kind of the Treaty for Dummies, what would be the main substantial arguments against ratifying among those states that do not ratify? What are the main reasons they are actually giving? Not maybe in rhetoric, but substantially. Is it because they want to keep the ability to test? Is it because it will destroy some sort of balance of power? Is it because they're waiting for others to sign it? If others do it, we will do it. I know probably different cases for each of the 8 most important countries, but it could be interesting to have that as a summary. Once again, thanks.
And then Rick,
Should China ratify CTBT before the United States? I'm not a specialist on CTBT, but my understanding is the answer depends on the impact of China's ratification or U.S. decision. Can China's ratification encourage or disencourage Americans to do that? So if China ratifies CTBT and it helps Americans to make that decision to do that, so I think China should do that before America. But if China ratifies CTBT, America will feel better and feel even more unwilling to ratify CTBT. Then I think it's better to not do that. So my understanding is Americans' decision will be more domestic politics issue. Not China's impact is kind of marginal, but which side, I don't know.
Okay.
We have the side grand total of 4 minutes, so you have 2 minutes,
Okay.
2 minutes each to
Let's
respond
start.
to the questions. Oh yes, James, you're jumping at the last moment.
I wanted to offer an answer from a US perspective about why the US is not
I
ratifying the
wanted to give an
CTBT.
answer too.
Suffice to say, I don't agree with this reasoning. I believe, look, there's a lot of argument about verification, stockpile stewardship, blah, blah, blah. At root, I think it's because there's a strong element in the US that simply opposes binding international law on the United States. And it is a visceral, maybe other Americans in the room will disagree with me, but fundamentally it comes down to a visceral dislike of anything that ties the US hands. And actually, unfortunately, I don't share Brad's optimism about the possibility of this administration changing its mind. Because if there's one thing that the president has been consistent on, it's a dislike of tying the US's hands in almost in any international forum that I can think of.
So, are there any?
Alexis.
Yes, sorry, Alexei.
Regardless of particular American attitude towards ratification, there is one serious objection to the treaty because it prohibits nuclear explosions only at the territory or sea space which is under national control of even any particular nation. But if you tacitly take a barge, take it to neutral waters and explode it, you could test, but that would be a secret violation of the treaty. That is an argument which is sometimes given in professional circles, but I have never met this argument given in US Congress against the ratification. So James is right. Their attitude is more political than technical. Another observation on China. I think the Chinese position on CTBT should have nothing to do with American position on CTBT. China has to live up to its official allegiance to the goal of nuclear disarmament. And signing, which China did, and ratifying CTBT would be a major support for Chinese cause in favor of nuclear disarmament, since China is the only country of the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states which doesn't give any information on its nuclear forces and nuclear programs. That is a very bad deficiency with respect to China. Chinese argument in support of this position do not hold any water. We can discuss it in detail, and I may give you the argument. So for China, ratifying CTBT would be important step of making up for the bad deficiency of Chinese position on nuclear disarmament with respect to transparency.
So I will be very fast. First point, our friend over there. The argument, traditional argument for supporting a test has to do that you need to have tests in order to build up weapons. In the past, for thermonuclear weapons, that was the case. Has been not the case since a long time. So the issue is that exactly what Mr. Acton was saying to you. The motivation is this. It's nothing to do with the original motivation. As far as Brad was mentioning, agreed. Exactly. The point is that we are trying to avoid, if you go back now in this situation to the Congress, we are not getting anywhere, probably. So the point is that the CTBT should be held in quiet environment, showing that it works, showing that it can in fact detect weapons around. And if the international community start believing that this is the case, which is in fact is the case, that will be enough. I would not make a big political fuss about the lack of ratification of the United States in this moment. China, Alexei told you exactly what I think it is. I always taught that to your Chinese friends. China should be lost. Its dependency should be its dependency on the United States. You are a big country. You have your own responsibility. By ratifying the CTBT, you will do a good job, and people will take notice. And I think that's it. And if you are too much dependent on the US, then we are going to go nowhere. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Final words.
Final words, I would say that 25 years ago, not 25 years ago actually, 20 some years ago, when the treaty went to the US Senate, I should say that it was a very different political environment. It was during Clinton administration, the State Department didn't do its proper work. And secondly, one of the strong arguments against the ratification of the treaty was that whether they can trust that there's a verification mechanism that can detect any nuclear test by any cheater. Yeah, that people might conduct nuclear tests while the US would not, and whether there's any verification system can detect. And at that time it was not ready, up and running. But that has changed. But the tone to be moderate also, we also appreciate and take note of that. But as Paolo said, I don't know, maybe we have to fly a bit under radar screen, or convince President Trump that no one else, no other president has been able.
Exactly.
To do this and to have the treaty ratified in the US Senate. So maybe that would, with his help, I believe if he's convinced, and we have to convince him, and I don't know how, so if he's convinced, I believe there's a great chance for ratification of the treaty if he can bring on board a couple of...
And maybe we have to convince the president that he will be the first one to stop the antagonism between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And maybe he should reintroduce the JPCOA in a different framework.
No, I'm talking about CTBTO.
This concludes our level panel. Please join me in a big round of applause for the speakers.
Thank you.